Welcome everyone, and today I have with me Deborah Grassman, who is one of the founders of Opus Peace, which is a not-for-profit operating out of the US, and I've been chasing Deborah for a couple of weeks trying to get this interview, so I'm really excited that we've got you. Welcome, Deborah. How are you in the States today on election day?
Oh, on edge, a little bit on edge, not really knowing what to expect and what to feel. So a lot of uneasiness today.
Yeah, well, we're all thinking about you, but let's talk a little bit about your background, because this is wonderful headline that you use. What do 5 hospice nurses and 10,000 dying veterans have to do with soul injury, or something like that?
Yeah.
How did all of this come about? Because you were a hospice nurse, is that right?
So a hospice nurse for 30 years at the VA. And during my 30-year career, I took care of more than 10,000 dying veterans.
Right.
And as you can probably guess, dying people in general know things the rest of us don't. And so hospice in general gives you a very unique perspective. But the other thing that I sort of happened upon that kind of became famous for was that traumatized people often know things the rest of us do not. And then you bring the confluence of both dying and trauma together. And those are 2 patient populations. There's not many people that have specialized in both trauma and hospice. See, that's kind of a unique confluence of patient populations. And that's the unique lessons, I think, that I have been privy to, in a way, in taking care of so many dying, traumatized people.
So somebody is getting ready to reach the end of their life and as meet their maker, or whatever their belief system might be. What, in your experience, normally happens if there is a soul injury? What are they searching for?
Well, in general, dying people sort of wake up. It's kind of paradoxical. You know, the day before you're given a terminal diagnosis, you sort of take life for granted.
Yeah.
The day after you're given a terminal diagnosis, you wake up, and you wake up to what really matters. Suddenly you realize what's important and what's not. And the things you thought were so important sort of fade into the background, and the things that you weren't paying too much attention to suddenly become urgent to complete. So that's sort of the gift that death is it wakes us up to how our life really matters. And in doing that, once we realize we get that sort of death sentence, that notice, so to speak, then we start paying attention to who we are and who we are not. And a lot of times, believe it or not, there's a lot of healing. I worked on an inpatient hospice unit. And I can tell you, Kathy, that there was more living going on that inpatient hospice unit than any other place in the hospital, any other place outside the hospital, or more healing than what was going on in my own home. Because you will see people reaching out for connection, people willing to ask for forgiveness. And you would often see people receiving forgiveness as well. And that kind of what I would call healing, that kind of peacefulness that can come in the face of such dire circumstances is really informative, is really instructive. And you don't really get to see that much anywhere else. You don't see that kind of advertisement on TV or anywhere that really says, let me tell you how to have true peace within yourself. Let me tell you how to be truly connected with your own self. But on a hospice unit, you will see that kind of journey happen, and it often happens pretty quickly. I always say that dying people are fertile ground for healing. Again, if you were given a terminal diagnosis, you would be willing to forgive things that otherwise you wouldn't normally, or you would be willing to take a stand against something that was wrong coming your way, that maybe before you didn't have the courage to take a stand. It wakes you up.
Okay, so is that noise coming your end or my end?
I hear no noise on my
Right,
end
okay.
or
So
your end.
okay. So let's just talk about you working in the hospice, and then you decided, okay, I think we've learnt something that we need to share with the world. How did that happen? Because you've got a group of other nurses working with you, correct? And you've set up a training program, which has just happened or happening at the moment, with the goal of training other people. So take us a bit on that journey.
Well, when we started the hospice unit, initially it was just a hospice unit. I didn't think too much about it being any different than any other hospice around the country. And it took me a while to realize that some veterans sort of had a different experience of death than non-veterans. And sometimes what it was if they had been, say, a combat veteran, pretend like, who had killed other people. See, I'm in the vantage point of seeing people, not working in a prison where maybe those people have killed other people. But I worked in an area where a lot of the people I cared for had killed other people. And those injuries sometimes surfaced at the end of life, so to speak. And it would sometimes cause them to be agitated. And so sometimes I would see an agitated death. And I want to tell you, that's an awful thing to see. And I don't want to convey in any way, shape, or form that combat veterans are going to have an agitated death. I don't mean that at all. But sometimes they did. And sometimes when I would peel back those layers, what would come forward at that time was some of the trauma they had witnessed, or some of the things that they had done, or sometimes they would feel like, survivor's guilt was really common. Why did my buddy get killed? And he was, I wasn't nearly as good a soldier as my buddy, and yet he's the one that got killed, and it should have been me. If I would have, stepped forward one minute earlier, it would have been me instead of him. A lot of those types of things would surface. And so I started realizing sometimes when we would see an agitated death, that sometimes it was the moral injury. That's a distinct subset that's clearly defined by the Department of Defense. And I was thrilled when moral injury surfaced, because I was going, yes, I see this a lot at end of life. But then there was also this bigger piece that was more about just not living the life that they should have lived, that they thought they should have lived, those types of things, that soul injury where they had never really connected. In the military, stoicism is really indoctrinated. And that's a good thing. You can't stop and fall apart on a battlefield, so you have to keep marching no matter what. The problem is, after they leave the military, oftentimes that stoicism creates a wall. And that wall separates them from their own sense of self. And even if you look up in the dictionary, Kathy, for the definition of stoicism, it says this: showing indifference to joy, grief, pleasure, and pain.
Wow.
Now I want you to think about the wall, the barrier that has to be created in order to be stoic. So see, stoicism isn't a moral injury, but stoicism can absolutely separate you. If you think you have to just always have this facade on all the time, it can separate you from your real self. So certainly stoicism was very common. And what you see at the end of life is that stoic wall starts crumbling. Whether you want it to or not, it sort of starts crumbling. And then you see this real self start to come out. And oftentimes what I saw is this peace-seeking, peace-loving person coming through, often from behind kind of a crusty outer shell. But as that crusty outer shell started peeling back, what you saw was this peace-loving human being emerging.
You make me want to cry.
They often did. I often cried at the bedside as you'd see these veterans making these discoveries, making these connections. Yeah.
So now with Opus Peace, you're saying what you've learnt about discovering the real self, and how soul injury impacts your whole life. You can help people to discover who they are and move forward. Would that be a good description?
You know, it really is, and kind of the difference that end of life has taught me, as opposed to sometimes self-help type stuff where it's like, be stronger, put more in there, be more resilient, you know, be happy, you know, do all this stuff to make yourself feel good. And, you know, that's not our approach at all. Our approach is this. You already have everything you need in order to be whole. It's already there. It's not a matter of trying to put more of that in there. It's not trying to have an infusion of being good and being better and being strong and whatever. It's more about remove the barriers that are keeping you from accessing your wholeness. So then you're going to say, well, what are those barriers?
Yeah.
And those barriers are unmourned loss and hurt, unforgiven guilt and shame, and fear of vulnerability, helplessness, and transitions. Those are basically the three barriers primarily that start coming down at the end of life and allow this part of self to just sort of surface on its own. So if you think about a baby is birthed into the world with unconscious wholeness. Unconscious wholeness. Well, what's the task? The task is to travel through life and become consciously whole, right? But what happens between birth and death is we get what I call scattered pieces of self. And the whole idea is to re-own that scattered piece, each scattered piece of self, create a safe place within ourselves so that part of self can come back home. Now, if I'm embarrassed to be hurt, let's say I'm a stoic person and I feel hurt or ashamed about something, and I've got to keep up this facade, I'm going to banish that part of self that's feeling sad, that wants to cry, that feels guilty about something I did or didn't do. I'm going to banish it into unconsciousness. But at some point, for healing or wholeness, what I want to do is to own it without shame, to re-own it, to create a safe place to say, hey, I will listen to you. Tell me how that hurt. Tell me how you are hurting. And maybe it was something that happened when you're, you know, we get these messages about not being good enough, not being cute enough, not being strong enough, not being smart enough. Anytime those messages go in at a young age, an impressionable time, and we live them out because we think we are that, then it's to reunite with that is to go back and say, tell me how that hurt when your dad told you that.
So I guess I do a lot of work with domestic and family violence victims, and what I'm hearing from your conversation is it's really helping to heal the unhealable, because all the therapy in the world is not going to help you find yourself if it's so locked into little incidences that you can't get to. Or you can't forgive yourself, or that you can't acknowledge even happened, which is part of the problem with post-traumatic stress. Would that be correct?
It would be very much correct.
Yeah, okay. So process-wise, and this is not a therapy session, everyone who's watching, what are some of the things that you would take people through as part of soul injury help them, because with moral injury, for example, group therapy is really helpful. Narrative storytelling, art therapy, those sorts of things seem to work, or at least they're being used at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we would also include those sometimes. Primarily, okay, if we look at unmourned loss and hurt, and typically, in general, at least people in America, I can't speak for the rest of the world, don't have that much experience with other cultures and what have you around the world, but at least in America, loss, when you talk about loss, people automatically think it's about bereavement. It's about loss after a death. But loss, you know, let's just say I'm disappointed. Let's just say I was going to have this interview with you and, you know, it didn't show up after all, and I would be disappointed. Just disappointment on a scale of 0 to 100, missing an interview might be just a 1 on the 0 to, but it's still a disappointment. Now let's pretend like I don't know how to mourn that little teeny tiny loss. Then what happens? What do I do? Oh, well, that Kathy didn't call me the way she was supposed to. She said it was going to be 5 o'clock Eastern time, and she was blah, 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 blah. So believe it or not, the secret for living in the present moment is to be able to let go of the past. And how you do that is to be able to grieve that, because that's what helps you let go. I often say it helps you move from, oh no, I can't believe I missed that interview, to, oh well, I missed the interview. And what allows you to move from, oh no, I can't believe that happened, to, oh well, it did happen, is grieving, being able to grieve from there to here. You know, Oprah had a guest, I hope I can say this right, a guest on her show, and he was had been in a concentration camp. So you talk about being able to do the work of forgiveness. His definition is the best of forgiveness that I've ever heard or read about, and it was, forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past can be any different than what it was.
So true. That's so true.
Let that sink in. Forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past can be any different than what it was. So when I talk about unforgiven, being able to mourn losses so you can let them go, being able to forgive what has happened, and wishing and wanting and trying on every level to make it go back to the way it used to be, instead being able to let go of that hope because the past cannot be changed. You know, those are keys for being able to live in the present moment. Too often, again, at least in America, being in the present moment means, oh, let me just, you know, do everything, you know, let me block out the past and let me not worry about the future so I can be in the present moment. And that's not the present moment at all, in my opinion. You know, the past is the past, and it is alive and well, as the research in trauma shows. You know, it is alive and well. So the past does live in the present moment, but it's being able to forgive the past for not being what we want it to be that allows us to be in the present moment. And there's a big difference. You know, sometimes people talk about thinking positive, and sometimes thinking positive is just blocking out anything negative. Well, if you are so afraid of negativity that you can't even think about it, that's not being positive. You know, when you are positive, you're not afraid of the negativity. You trust yourself, your own beingness, to be able to handle whatever comes, good, bad, ugly, beautiful. You have self-confidence, self-connection, that there'll be a lesson for you, that you will be able to be in it and with it. You don't have to block it out and use denial to pretend like there's no negativity. Oh, I'm just not going to think anything negative. Big difference between thinking positive and being positive.
So there's two really profound observations for me. One is clearly grief and loss, and I talk about that a lot in our work, and certainly with our community, which is this going out to. We tend to think of grief and loss only as end of life. We don't think about it impacts us almost every day throughout our lives in some shape or form,
Absolutely.
like the examples you've given. And we need to normalize grief and loss. It's part of the human condition, which is really what your work is embodying. It's like being now in the present and determining what you put around that experience. And then the other thing that the parallel that I see is there's an enormous connection between the work of Dr. Brene Brown and what you're talking about the vulnerable self and you know, shame, which is just an awful experience and often sits under anger. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think shame is the #1 cause of soul injuries. The advantage, I think, of soul injury and the work, at least this is what I'm being told by so many healthcare professionals, is that soul injury provides a language. It conceptualizes and gives a language for us to be able to have a discussion about what it is that is the injury. You know, because if you think about it, the DSM, there is nothing, I mean, we all know how losing our sense of self causes problems, real problems in very practical ways and mental health ways and lots of different ways. And yet there is nothing that classifies and gives a language to when you lose your sense of self. There's no language for it.
No.
So part of what I have found, we have a lot of healthcare professionals that take our training, and what they come away with, oh, this is so practical. Now I have the words and I can have a discussion with people. And, you know, you talk to people. I remember one time we have a soul injury inventory. You probably saw it on our website. And I had this one woman, she took the inventory, and after she did, she printed it up. She took it to her adult daughter. She gave it to her daughter. She said, here, I want to give this to you, and I'd like for you to take it. And after you do, let's have a discussion about the soul injury I gave you when you were a child because of my alcoholism.
Wow.
Wow. She said that totally changed their relationship, because it opened, see, there was a language, a non-threatening language to have a discussion about what happened. And you see, there automatically comes the loss that adult daughter had as a child, because mom was numbed out. It brought about the opportunity for mom to ask for forgiveness. I am so sorry that I did that to you. So we have tools. When you talk about some of the tools, you know, how do you ask for forgiveness? And there's lots of books written about this. However, what I have found is that most of them don't address something very basic, which is often it's the wrong part of self that's asking for forgiveness. So if, you know, if I have been damaged as a child because, say, a parent, like in this example, mom drank too much, and my adult self that's sitting here with you right now says, oh, I forgive mom for what she did. That part of self, this adult self that has, you know, gone on and done all, you know, all these good things or successful things, doesn't have the authority to forgive mom. What part of self has the authority to forgive mom? It's the part of self that was hurt. And maybe that part of self is still over here in the corner, hurting. And so teaching people about different aspects of self. So when you asked earlier about the tools that we use, part is Gestalt, and thinking about scattered. That's why we use the language of scattered pieces of self, and having those scattered pieces, becoming aware of those scattered pieces, being able to identify them, and entering into a dialogue with them so we can hear what they're saying. Sometimes I liken it to, I always say, you know, you're the CEO of you. And around your table, you have lots of different scattered pieces of self. But here's the deal. You like this one, and you don't like that one too much. And this one gets their way with you all the time. And this one, anytime they try to speak up, you shut them down and tell them to get out. You know, this one always gets your ear, you know, that type of thing. And so that's kind of how we do it in a kind of a metaphorical way, of bringing congruity, bringing integration of these scattered pieces of self. And we pay a lot of attention to Bessel van der Kolk's work. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He has the Center for Trauma in Boston. He's well researched. He's very holistic and integrative in his approach. So we kind of pretty much follow his work in using that with trauma. And as I said, some people are traumatized, and then if that trauma causes them to lose their sense of self, then they might also have a soul injury. So we will do both. But not everybody does. You know, Marie Bainbridge, she's our president emeritus of Opus Peace. She was one of the 5 nurses that started Opus Peace. She is a Vietnam veteran. She has PTSD. And she will talk about the different triggers that cause her, you know, a helicopter goes overhead and she immediately is triggered. And what she hears in her mind is incoming, incoming. That's what she hears. But she will tell you she does not have a soul injury. She says she was raised in such a strong, loving family that gave her such a sense of self that not even Vietnam could squeeze her out of her.
My goodness, my goodness.
So again, so there's, you know, just because you have PTSD doesn't mean you have a soul. They are not, you know, mutually inclusive. So you might have one and might not have the other, and vice versa. The other, you probably saw my, you said you saw my TED Talk. So, you know, in there, you know, sometimes I feel embarrassed to tell my own little story of my dad when I was 5 laughing at me because I was crying with this television show about this dog, Lassie, that was about to be killed. And I'm crying and he laughed at me. And at 5 years old, I made this decision to never cry again, to never cry again. And I didn't for 30 years. And I'm going to tell you, you can lose yourself a lot of different ways. And I'm going to tell you that I lost myself by making a decision at age 5 to not be laughed at again, that I would, because I would not cry. And so I became ashamed. See, the shame that came with anytime I wanted to cry. And as a kid, you know, you want to cry, you're sad, you're hurt. It's a natural feeling. But I thought there was something wrong with me that I would cry. And so I became ashamed of that part of myself. So again, that seems like a very innocuous way to acquire a soul injury. But when you're a little kid, you make these kinds of decisions in your brain and it can have life-lasting impact. Just the other day, just 2 days ago, I had a man in probably his early 50s who tearfully told me, he said, "Oh my gosh," he said, "when I was a teenager, my dad told me that I would never amount to anything. And he said, I have spent every year since that time proving him wrong." And now he wakes up and realizes he's led an artificial life. He's led a life, instead of living the life that he was meant to have, he's leading the life that he would want to prove to his father that he is a real person, that he is successful.
So how would someone know that they might have a soul injury? Is it you know, should they download the inventory from your website? What are some of the signs that something's not right?
I think it's just living a life where you feel like there's a part of you missing, maybe a bit of emptiness, regret that just keeps nagging at you, a sense that you're just going through the motions, not living an authentic life, or that you're living a lie, that you can't be who you really are, that you just don't fit in, that no matter what you do, you're still not good enough, strong enough, cute enough, you know, all of those kinds of things. All of those things that have to do with your being who you are. You know, one of the things you'll see on our website, the last line, we have what we call an Opus Peace prayer or affirmation, however you want to put it. But the last line is, release me from my fear of who I am and who I am not. So much of it is about penetrating the fear that can grasp us and hold us. And, you know, so much of it is about releasing the fear to discover who we really are. You know, I'm thankful that at about age 35, I was feeling, I was in a situation that was very hurtful, and I wasn't crying, hadn't cried since I was 5. And it dawned on me, I was like, oh my gosh, my fear of feeling my pain has to be, what if it's worse than if I just let myself feel it? And for the first time in 30 years, I let myself cry. And that was really the first day, that's when my liberation started. That's when I felt just a little bit more reconnected with myself than I had been. So, you know, at whatever age, it can come at any age. And I'm going to tell you that on people's deathbeds, it comes often, and it comes fast. And the veil between life and death thins very quickly when you're on a hospice unit. And I had one patient say it, like, I always call it the unvarnished truth often surfaces. I remember I had one patient who was, he'd been alcohol used a lot during his life, numbing agents, that type of thing, sort of estranged from his family. And when he got this terminal diagnosis, he sobered up. And so at his bedside, here's all of his family. It was a very loving family and what have you during this time. And I said to him, I commented on his courage that it had taken for him to put down his numbing agent and to become honest with who he was and who he wasn't. And he looked at me and he said, you know, now while I'm dying is no time for me to be lying to myself.
True.
Yeah, and I burst out laughing. I said, you are so right. You see, so that facade comes down. When you're given a terminal diagnosis, you've got nothing to lose now.
Yeah.
So people become, that facade often comes down. People become very honest. And that was kind of the milieu that I had the privilege of working in. I mean, it is a lesson. I mean, you get to see ways of living, not just ways of dying, but you get to see ways of living that informed my life, gave me honesty, courage, and humility to live my own life.
Yeah. So you're saying when you're training healthcare practitioners, they're absorbing this. They're saying this is wonderful. This is giving us a language to help our patients.
Yes.
Is that's correct? And how often do you run the training programs?
Well, we were doing them twice a year, and we've been doing that. We ran 8 of them every 6 months for 4 years. And then, you know what happened to the world, and we had to cancel our last 2, our last 2 face-to-face ones. But what we ended up doing with this one in October that we did last week was we ran it virtually. Scared half to death, not knowing, oh gosh, because we don't just give information for the head. We don't just provide stories to touch the heart, but we, how our training is different than most is we give people an experience of themselves. And to be able to do that virtually, we weren't sure if we could bridge that virtual gap. And we came up with some very creative things to do that. We sent everybody what we call a behold box to hold your being with all the self-help tools inside. So we mailed that to them ahead of time. But they couldn't open it. It was all part of, we do a lot of different ceremonies as well, because ceremonies are powerful because they access the unconscious. And you know, if you design it in the right 3-step process that anthropologists teach us how to do. And I had gotten my master's degree in doing my thesis related to rituals and ceremonies and their relationship to hope. So that had kind of started my interest in it. But at any rate, so they opened the tools in certain ceremonial ways, and it truly was, by the end of the 4th day, something to behold. We had 61 participants, and yeah, so we're figuring out how to do it. We're holding another one. I think it's the last week in February.
And are there any graduates in Australia yet?
No graduates in Australia. We have one in the UK. Two in the UK, and 2 in Switzerland is what we have at the moment that are not from America, and we have 200 here in the States.
Fantastic. So 2 last questions. First of all, this is really daunting work. So how do you take care of yourself? That's the first question, because it must really drain your box, so to speak. And then the second question is, what closing comments would you like to share with people that know nothing about soul injury that they can take away from this conversation?
Well, what I do for self-care, you probably didn't notice it, but when you asked me the question, you actually put both of your hands up here like this and held your heart. We call that the anchoring heart technique, which is a way of staying connected, and I often use it. So to give you an example, when you're calm and relaxed, your energy's down low. And when you get anxious and upset, your energy comes up here. And if you got some bad news, you'd actually go and grab yourself. Well, why do you do this? It's because this is a very natural, unconscious grounding technique to keep us in our skin, to keep us connected. When you're triggered, you kind of want to disconnect, you disappear. And so one of the things I often teach is, especially in dealing with triggers and anxiety, is rather than doing this unconsciously, which our body knows how to do it unconsciously, just use it consciously. Hold your heart, anchor it tenderly, firmly, and breathe deeply. And that's kind of the easiest part. The next part is to let yourself feel whatever you do not want to feel at this moment. So let's just say it's hurt. Oh, I don't want to feel hurt. Just let yourself breathe and feel it for a moment, just for a moment. And then the third step is to take a pause and realize there's a part of you that's been holding that hurt for you unconsciously all along. I mean, it's there already. The body keeps the score. It's already there. Take a moment to just be aware that there's a part of you that is strong enough to hold the pain for you and has been holding the pain for you. And see, that's the irony. Connect with the part of yourself holding your hurt, and you will also be connecting with the part of yourself holding your courage.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
So to answer your question, that I do meditate daily. I live a life of passion. I'm passionate about my work. There is nothing more fulfilling than doing work with soul injured people and seeing them re-own and rehome scattered piece. Even just one scattered piece of themselves can be so liberating for them. And as I said, we just came out of a training where I saw a whole screen full of people, and we do a screen. If we did a screenshot on day 1 and a screenshot on day 4, it's amazing the countenance of people as they change, because they have a little bit more of them in their faces, in their movements, in how they are with themselves. And that to me is, the work I do is a labor of love. I mean, I've been doing this work for a very long time. To be able to share some of the lessons, people at the end of life exhibit a lot of wisdom, oftentimes. Wisdom, not knowledge, not experience, but wisdom. Wisdom comes from a different place. You can have 2 people go through the same life experience, and one will come, I've seen many people go through the exact same war in the same unit, and one will come out, bitter, and one will come out wise. So, you know, wisdom often surfaces at the end of life. People have access to that deeper part of self at the end of life. And so that's why I would often just sit at the bedside and just not just listen with my ears, but listen with my heart and ask those questions about their regrets and what they would do differently and what they have learned in the last week of their lives about what's important and what's not, and just taking that in. Yeah, there's that unvarnished truth. There's nothing like that kind of unvarnished truth to teach, bear witness to.
Thank you for joining us. So where do people, would you like to give us your website address and how they get hold of you?
Yeah, of course. So Opus Peace, OPUSPEACE, opuspeace.org. The word opus, if you, it's an old Latin word that means work or masterpiece. It's often associated with classical music to mean a composer's most masterful, complex work. But it's really not just for music, it can be for anything. And I often say, you know, when we can be our true self, it takes work to do that, courageous work to be who we are meant to be. And most people will say at the end of their lives that their journey to be who they truly are and have the courage to be who they truly are is their opus. So anyway, opuspeace.org, or you can also do soulinjury.org. Either way will get you to the same website. And we have a lot of free materials there, the anchoring heart technique, the TED Talk, the soul injury inventory, a lot of descriptors that describes the difference, the chart. I have a chart there that describes the difference between soul injury, moral injury, and PTSD. So a lot of informational things as well that we hope people will partake of.
Thank you so much for joining us. What an enlightening conversation.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. Thank you for the work you're doing.